We are in Hebrews chapter 3. We'd gone through verse 13 last week, that we need to exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. And we were about to start in verse 14. And in verse 14, we're dealing with a section that we're of Christ if we hold fast. That began back in verse 12 and goes through verse 19. And y'all should have that on your outline. For we are made partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast unto the end. Partakers. Y'all have probably heard the Greek term koinonia. Remember what it means?
Fellowship.
Fellowship. Generally translated that, but also partakers, communion, contribution. Has the meaning, though, basically of fellowship. That's not the word that's used here. It's, make sure I spell right. Yeah. M-E-T-O-C-H-O-S, I believe. Toikos. And it literally means one who holds with another. In the noun form, it is to participate in something or with someone. To participate in something or with someone. The verbal form is to hold with. It's used back in chapter 1 in verse 9. There it's translated fellows. And it's also used in chapter 2 in verse 14. Translated took part of. Wuest, in talking about this word, says that in 2:14, 3:1, 5:13, 6:4, 7:13, 12:8.
Well, with Hebrews 1:9, could you correctly have translated that partakers without doing violence to the passage?
Probably so.
Thank you.
It is used of participators in something. The phrase thus refers to the possession of salvation of the believer, a salvation which is in Christ, end quote. So you are made partakers. The are made is a Greek word, genomai is the word, but it is in the perfect tense. Now what does perfect tense indicate?
Continuation.
That's perfect. That's present tense.
Means completed action in past time?
Well, completed action would be aorist tense.
Yeah, okay.
So it's the past, the present, and the future.
Not necessarily. It's a past action or a completed action with continuing results. The results of that action continues.
What's the distinction between continuing action and past time and the way you described it? There's a small distinction?
There is distinction. One is a continuing action. This is the results of that action are continuing. The death of Christ, for example. Christ died for our sins. That's a completed action. He doesn't continue to die, does he? Mm-hmm. He died for our sin. Did the results of that death continue?
In Hebrews 7:9, when it describes him as died only once, is that where you translate that same thing?
I would have to look. I don't know right offhand.
Okay.
But the results of his death continue. So there's your distinction. Here, it's the idea we have become partakers of Christ, and we continue to be partakers of Christ. So it's a past action. They became partakers, continuing results, continuing to be partakers of Christ. But notice the conditional statement, if. There is a condition. Now, of course, those who would try to teach that once saved, always saved doctrine would have to eliminate the if. There's no if with them. But there is in the text, of course. If we hold fast the confidence, hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast unto the end. Word confidence. It is a Greek word. Make sure I get it right. T-A-S-I-S, yeah. Hypostasis, made up of two parts. Hypo, this part here, means under. It's a prefix meaning under. Stasis means to place or to put. So you have to place under. This is something that has been placed under. It's the word translated over in Hebrews 11 in verse 1, substance, that faith is the substance. It is the hypostasis. It is that which has been placed under our faith. Now, what's the idea? It's the basis of it. It's the ground, the assurance of it. Like a foundation. You place the house on top of a foundation. The foundation becomes the basis of the house.
So what would be a synonym for confidence in 4:14? If you were to translate it different with another, make it make sense.
Assurance, the guarantee would be a couple of words that you might use.
Could you use seal?
Seal?
Like they use in Ephesians 1? Wouldn't sound so good, would it? In our modern.
The seal would, an idea of a seal would carry some different ideas. You might be able to, but a seal would not necessarily be something that, like this, would be placed under to be the confidence or the assurance. The undergirding might be another word. The basis might be another word.
But it would be a chain of reference in Hebrews 11:1.
Just the word itself.
Oh, only the word? Okay.
The meaning of the word.
Okay.
Since I doubt that we'll get to Hebrews 11 in the class, we'll have a little bit of information about that one now. So here's, if we hold that beginning of that assurance, that confidence, that undergirding that we have, steadfast unto the end. In verse 15, he goes on then, while it is said, today if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts as in the provocation. Back in verse 13, there was a warning against hardening the heart. This is more of an exhortation not to do it. So you have a warning, don't do it. Now then, the exhortation, please don't do it. If I can use that type of a phraseology. The provocation is, of course, when the Jews listened to the evil report of the 10 spies instead of the good report of Joshua and Caleb. And thus, as a result of listening to that evil report, they did not go in to take the land. So, don't listen to the evil reports, if you kind of substituting that idea in. Don't listen to those things. Now, what were the evil reports of this time? What would they have been?
You mean in the first century?
That Paul was dealing with.
Kind of divine circumcision and keeping the law of Moses and stuff like that?
Not necessarily. That would not be a part of it, but what's the purpose of the book of Hebrews?
Preventing apostasy.
Prevent apostasy. What was taking place?
Well, some people were saying the resurrection already took place and all.
Some were going back to Judaism.
Not here.
Some were going back to Judaism.
Some were going back into Judaism, but why? They were basically saying Christ is not. The Mosaic law is superior to the Christian law. It's greater than anything. Moses was greater than Christ. Thus, don't go to that. Leave it and come back into Judaism.
Take heed, brethren, lest there be any of you an evil heart of unbelief, departing from the living God.
Well, in the departing there, not just leaving Christianity, it's a specific thing in leaving Christianity to go back into Judaism within the context of Hebrews. Now, application, yes, it would be leaving Christianity in any way, but what Paul's dealing with is leaving Christianity to go back into Judaism. Why? Because these Jews were saying that it's superior to Christianity.
So a good chain of reference of Hebrews 3:12 and 13 would be Hebrews 1 or 2. Because that was
the whole book of Hebrews is dealing with the same thing.
There's tons of verses in Hebrews that tie back to
the whole thing. Everything. If you lose sight of that, you've lost sight of the entire purpose of Hebrews.
When he uses the term living God, is he referring to Christ?
In verse 12, I would say it would probably refer to the Father there, but it could refer, probably, thinking about it more, I'd say it probably refers to Father and Son, Godhead, the deity, and departing from God.
If you disavow Jesus here, you're going to disavow God. I mean, go back into what you were already in.
Paul has already shown that Jesus is Jehovah to them. And so that's the name of God. Either way you want to take it, I think you could find justification for arguing either way on that.
It just struck me odd that he put the living God using that. I don't see that very ever,
That is interesting to me because, let me see something. Because generally the phraseology is the God of the living. And yeah, that's really what it is here, to depart from God of the living. But that's the general use of the way in which it's used.
So it should have been God of the living and not what it's translated?
No, not necessarily. The only thing is, it could be, and here's the distinction that you can go either way. It can deal with that he is living, or it can be he's the God of those who are living. He's the God of the living. Who is it? Those people who have accepted Christ.
So you get it when you get into Him by baptism, you become living. In other words, it's thought.
Well, that would be true. That would be the case. That would be the case. Remember Matthew 22. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. in answer to the Jews, or the Sadducees in particular, that I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living.
Before Abraham was
The living, the God of the living. God. And so a lot of times it could be that aspect. It can go either way, depending on context. Verse 16 then, for some, when they had heard, did provoke, howbeit not all that came out of Egypt by Moses. Paul is saying here, for who, having heard, did provoke. And basically, he's dealing with the entire generation of the Jews. When he says not all that came out of Egypt by Moses, well, who's the not all?
Everyone that of that generation who was 20 and older, except Joshua.
Okay, the not all is really Joshua and Caleb. Now we understand that it was 20 and older, but the not all has reference to Joshua and Caleb. So here's these individuals who heard, having heard, they provoked, except, and that's not all that came out of Egypt by Moses. Joshua and Caleb did not. Verse 17, but with whom he was grieved 40 years, was it not with them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? So here's these 40 years that they were wandering in the wilderness. And because God was grieved with them, they're dying off.
It's kind of confusing when I read some of these italicized words when it's applied, because it looks like it says not with them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness, and they must have had a funny way of phrasing themselves back in the first century, because they had to supply that to make it sensible to us, but they would have phrased it differently back then. It confuses me sometimes.
You're dealing with two different languages, Dale.
I know, it's kind of confusing.
And the grammar of each language.
Yeah.
But think of the deaths. In fact, over in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 5, it says there, but with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. That word overthrown literally expresses the idea they were strewn down along. They were strewn down along in the wilderness. Estimates range from anywhere from the low end to the high end, 7 million people coming out of Egypt, Jews. Anywhere from 2 to 7 million. Taking a general idea of 4 million, you would then have, on a daily basis, 274 deaths every day.
Now you figure that. It's arithmetic, huh?
4 million divided by 40 divided by 365.
Oh, okay. You did some simple arithmetic.
Not difficult.
Oh, okay.
So it is literally a death march that they were on. Now that's on the average, of course. Some days there were thousands who died.
Like in Florida.
Jim?
You think they were protected up until that time, the ones that were still with Moses and were up in age? A lot of them about, maybe even close to the Moses age, and God just allowed them to start dying very fast at that time, or you think it's just normal?
The 40 years period, you've got a long period of time. So someone who's 20, you're talking about 60 when
And in
the
very
end.
harsh conditions too.
Very harsh conditions, but a lot of them would simply be matter of time. You take someone 60 years old, they're not going to.
But their shoes are not wearing out while this is going on. It's kind of.
God provided for them. Their clothes didn't wear out. Their shoes didn't. They were provided food, and yet it was a death march.
That's confusing to me. I don't know why it is.
Well, I don't either. So,
Were they buried or were they left? Do you know? Anything in history that indicates?
it would be just in my thinking, and I don't know, so, and I haven't read anything along this line, but I would think it would be just very difficult to travel any at all if you were
Had to
bury all
I
of
was
them.
thinking the same thing. They had to just
But I don't know. It would be very unlikely not to bury them too. So
was there provisions made or possibility? This is probably a stupid question. A lot of people are going to say, but could they repent and proselytize lives back into faithfulness by like offering offerings again, and you get forgiveness? Even
they
though
could have received forgiveness, but they were dead.
Right, but they could still go to heaven.
They were going to die physically.
Right.
And as far as spiritual aspect, they were not able to enter into the promised land. Now, then, what does all that implies? I don't know.
Bible don't spell it out anywhere.
No. Moses was not able to enter into the promised land.
Right.
Yet we have knowledge that he was saved. He was in paradise.
There's not one chain reference about that issue. That's another thing that's always confused me. I guess I shouldn't worry about it, huh?
All right, verse 18. And to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest, but to them that believe not. Believe not. Okay. Anyone know the common word for believe? Greek word?
Pistis.
Okay, pistis would be the noun form. Pisteuo would be the verbal form, pisteuo. That's not what's here, though. To make this not faith, you'd put an alpha in front of it, an A, and that negates it. So, basically for Greek, any word that you wanted to negate, you'd just put an alpha prefix on it. So, apisteuo would be no faith. Theos would be God. Atheist, atheos, would be no God. So, the word, though, that's translated here, fail, or with the negative, apitho.
What's that word now? Bethel, what was that?
Well, I'm fixing to define it.
Okay.
Literally, it is not allowing, or if you take the I off, allowing oneself to be persuaded and thus obeying. Or not allowing oneself to be persuaded and thus disobeying. This word that's used here, apitheo, is more descriptive of the character of that generation. Their character was disobedient or believing not. And if you go back and you think about their life and what took place, you can start understanding why he's using this phraseology. Now, it's interesting, a lot of times in the Bible, they will use both of these terms in the same context. And basically saying, for example, they are equivalent. And yet, this one deals more with obedience, and this one with more the attitude of faith. And in fact, a lot of translations will use obey or disobey in regards to this word.
Aren't there many contexts where unbelief and obedience and belief is used almost in the thought of each interchangeably in context?
In fact, we have it here.
Like in the Gospel too.
We have it right here, verse 19. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. Unbelief is the noun form of this. Their character was this, they were this, and thus they could not enter in. So you see that basically they are put within the same context. They don't mean the same thing, but here they could not enter in because they were apostille.
And so a chain reference to that would be Galatians 5:6, wouldn't it? Faith works by love. In a roundabout way, but those love and obedience kind of like reflect each other.
This deals more with faith and works.
So if you have no faith, you're not going to see any need for repentance.
Right. Without faith, you don't have works. Obedience. With obedience, you have this. With faith, you do have obedience. James 2 would be more your reference. That without faith, there's no works. That works prove your faith. But he doesn't use this word in James 2, of course. But it's, I said, many translations will use the word obey or obedience in translating that. In chapter 4, we have 3 Sabbaths or 3 rests that are linked together. What does Sabbath mean, by the way?
It means rest, I think.
Yeah, day of rest.
Okay, that's right, it means rest. Very good. I figured for sure I'd get somebody to say it means seventh or Saturday, but it means rest. So 3 Sabbaths here are being discussed, or 3 rests being linked together actually. The first one is creation, the second one is Canaan, and the third one is heaven. So that's what we're going to see in chapter 4. In the first 10 verses, Jesus' rest is greater than Joshua's rest. Now in verses 1 through 3, the danger of losing that rest. Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. Fear here is the Greek word phobia, phobos. A phobia would be the noun form. It's fear. His rest here.
What is the fear of Proverbs 1:7 or Matthew 10:28? It's not phobos, is it?
I would imagine Matthew 10 would be phobia. Now then, in Proverbs 1, you're dealing with a different language. You're dealing with Hebrew, so and And I don't know what the Septuagint would use there. Here's entering into his rest. It's not obviously a physical rest here that we're talking about, but it's a spiritual rest, God's own rest.
I thought phobos was the sinful type of fear.
No, it's not.
It isn't?
No. Not at all.
Really?
You might be thinking of another word that deals with timidity.
Yeah.
But fear, we're supposed to have fear.
So what would the word fearful in Revelation 21 be? Phobos? Not phobos, would it?
I don't know offhand.
Okay.
But his rest here is a spiritual rest. It's God's own rest that we'll see in verse 4 and verse 5. And so you have fear lest you fall short of that. Don't enter into that rest, God's spiritual rest. For unto us was the gospel preached as well unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. Gospel preached here is the Greek word euangelizo. It literally means to bring good news or to evangelize. And thus gospel preached, the good news being brought unto them. The phrase, the word preached, is literally the word of hearing. And it's interesting, preached here, when you hit this, for unto us was the gospel preached, that's euangelizo, as well unto them, but the word preached, there it's a different word. It's akouo, A-K-O-N, or A-K-O-E, but it's pronounced with an
I
A.
remember that in Greek class and Greek Harvard and here.
Akouo, here, the word preach deals more with the sense or the faculty of hearing. So here's the gospel, the good news is proclaimed, but the word of hearing, that is that faculty or sense, the hearing of that word, did not profit them. Because it was not mixed with faith. And here, faith is this pisteuo or pistis.
So you said you could translate that, the word of hearing, instead of the word preached?
Yes, the word of hearing is a literal phraseology. Because it did them no good, it didn't profit them because it was not mixed with faith, pisteuo, or pistis in the noun form here. And one lexicon put it that pistis is ranging in meaning from subjective confidence to objective basis for confidence. In other words, the subjective confidence would be one's faithfulness. The subjective, he has faith. Objective basis would be that which they heard. Here, it's that objective basis for confidence. It did them no good. They preached that objective faith.
Yeah,
But what happened? They didn't have faith.
That's kind of confusing with it. They don't have the article like in Jude 3, but I know I'm sounding childish, but it's kind of confusing.
Well, that's because faith isn't always used in the same way.
Yeah.
There in Jude 3, it's talking about the faith, the body of truth of the New Testament.
So sometimes you can use pistis to imply the doctrine that you're believing in without having to actually mention the word "the" there. In other words,
Pistis oftentimes means faithfulness. One's
behind the
faithfulness.
scenes in supplying the faith without having to say it, in other words.
Yet in Romans 14 it has reference to one's own personal scruples.
Is that correct then, what I just said?
What?
That it implies the faith without having to just actually
Not
say the
necessarily.
word. Not necessarily.
No.
Okay.
Context
Okay.
always determines it. Romans 14 does not imply the faith.
Okay.
It's one's personal scruples.
So you've got to find a word in the context that has it
That's always the case.
always, without exception. Okay.
Verse 3, for we which have believed do enter into rest. As he said, I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. Those who did believe, pisteuo again, on this occasion, would enter the rest. If they shall enter, is, or in chapter 3 and verse 11, is they shall not enter. So you're dealing with in 3:11 that if they shall enter, the idea they're not going to enter. They shall not enter. Here, those who enter in the rest do have faith. Those who do not have faith shall not enter in.
Can I ask another question? Are there any words, are the words of Galatians 3 that has faith parallel to Hebrews in a lot of ways, or do you have that information in your head, off the top of your head?
If you're asking for as to the word faith, I don't have the information off the top of my head. Galatians would be parallel to Hebrews and to a great extent in that Galatians is dealing with the Judaizing teachers. So, look at the 95th Psalm and specifically verse 11. Unto whom I swear in my wrath that they should not enter into my rest. And so Paul is using this from the 95th Psalm in relationship to these individuals and applying it now. Even that they who have believed enter in, those who don't didn't. And he's sworn thus in his wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works, and notice this is my rest now. It's my rest. What was the rest of that they were going to enter into? Canaan. Yeah, land of Canaan. This though now is my rest, he says. That would be heaven. The works were finished from the foundation of the world is that there is a rest implied in the completion of God's work. The fact that he rested on the seventh day, there is the implication in that there is a rest for the people of God. And God had provided for those coming out of Egypt a rest. That rest was Canaan. But that unbelieving generation did not enter into it. They didn't enter into it.
Does that mean we don't get the rest till we get to heaven?
That's right. From a spiritual standpoint. Sometimes from a physical one too, but we're not dealing with that. Spiritual standpoint, we don't rest until we die.
You can't say, I've already done my time, let somebody else do it.
That's right. Verse 4, for he spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise. And God did rest on the seventh day from all his works. And that's what we were saying. And we're actually, verses 4 through 8, we're dealing now with a type of heavenly rest. And we see God rested on the seventh day, Genesis 2 and verse 2. Well, that implies that there is a greater rest that's available. In verse 5, and in this place again, place italicized, of course, if they shall enter into my rest. In this place again, what place? Well, Psalm 95 verse 11. That's what he's referring to. If they shall enter in 3:11, is they shall not enter in. So, and in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest, it's actually they shall not enter into my rest. That's what he's dealing with, those individuals. But there's an underlying aspect. In verse 6, saying, therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein, and to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief. And again, he limiteth a certain day, saying in David, today after so long a time, as it is said, today if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts. In verse 6, some must enter therein. Well, the next generation of Israelites did enter in. So here's the land of Canaan. That generation that came out of Egypt, God was grieved with them. They did not enter into the rest, Canaan's rest. But some did enter. Who? The next generation entered into that rest. But Paul is talking about something other than the seventh day of creation rest or the Canaan rest. And we see that's the case in verse 7. And that's why I read that as well. Saying in David, well, David's the one we've been quoting from in the 95th Psalm. And chapter 3 and verse 7, another aspect, the Holy Spirit said it. Well, now then he says David said it. Well, it's inspiration, another little teaching about inspiration. But after so long a time what? Between Moses and David. Here's Moses bringing them out of Egypt to do what? To enter into the rest. Many didn't go in. Why? Because of unbelief. Joshua and Caleb did. The next generation goes in. But between Moses and David's still talking about this rest. What does that tell us? They entered into a rest, but it really wasn't the rest that he's promising. There's another rest, a greater rest than Canaan's rest. These individuals entered into the rest, yet David's saying there's still a rest remaining for the people of God.
Was the reason that they didn't enter into Canaan, I know God said they couldn't, but it was still their unbelief that they couldn't take it.
Yes.
So, I mean, it was their own thoughts that would keep them out, or not
their own unbelief.
Just like
their initial unbelief.
Our unbelief would keep us out of heaven.
Yes. Their initial unbelief. Did they remain in that unbelief?
I mean, when Moses went up and looked over into it, I would assume if no one was struck dead because they tried to go up there to get it, it was their own unbelief. They were still thinking that there was giants in the land, I would assume, that they couldn't take it.
Well, remember now, when they first said we can't take it, God said, okay, you're going to die in the wilderness. They then went and tried to take it. And they failed. Still unbelief. So they wandered in the wilderness. They came back. At that time, they understood they could, I would say. That they were following God's will. And in relationship to harden not your hearts here, that goes back to Psalm 95, 7 and 8, where he says basically the same thing. That's showing again still that here they had entered into Canaan's rest, yet don't harden your hearts so that you can enter into Canaan's, the true Canaan, that which Canaan represented, which is God's rest. Now, and that's going to be important for the next verse in verse 8, which we'll start with next week.